Hello and welcome to this new video. Today we're going to go over a brief introduction to the basic differences between manga and comics from a cultural standpoint and how this difference in treatment may be leading to the industry boom that we see today. And also, just as a quick note, I have not included my works cited for this particular presentation, though I will try to mention sources as I come across them in my own writing. Still, even without a works cited, most everything that I will be presenting on here today is open access contextual information on the history of comics and manga, along with my own theory about distribution. I am currently, or at least I was at the time of making this presentation, working on a paper regarding this subject, but it's been a few years and I haven't updated this presentation, though I am updating the recording because there were sound quality issues with the first one. Um, Still, hopefully, as I continue to advance in my research, hopefully this project will also advance. But in the meantime, thank you for listening, and I hope you find this helpful. First, I'll give you a brief introduction about myself. My name is Peggy Wood, and I currently work at a junior college and technical college. I'm hoping to pursue further graduate work, either in Asian studies or comparative literature sometime in the future. And this presentation was part of my preparation for research into that field. Since the initial presentation, I have become much more involved in the field of anime and manga research. So there's a note on that. In addition to my work in education, I'm also the editor of a small blog called The Anime View, which you can see at theanimeview.com. And the Anime View initially started as an outlet for my obsession with anime and manga that I was viewing at the time. However, it has since developed from a solo blog into a small blogging team wherein we aim to create content that provides our audience of animation and comics fans with a mix of content that engages the mind to look critically at the media that we love and consume. Currently, many posts have centered on manhwa and other Korean publications, slightly shifting away from the heavier Japanese influences of the blog's origins, but not entirely. And with new contributors joining the fray, we're looking towards games, American animated and comic media, industry knowledge, and other news to share with our growing readership. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the topic. What is the difference between manga and comics? I hear this quite a lot from people outside the community, and it's a question that usually is paired with, isn't manga just the Japanese word for comics? Well, the word manga comes from the Japanese kanji seen at the top right of this slide. The first kanji being pronounced mon, meaning whimsical or impromptu, and the second ga, meaning pictures. So, in a very basic translation, we can say that yes, manga is essentially the Japanese words for comics. However, if you ask most Western fans if the two are the same thing, you will often hear them answer no. And why is this? Let's go ahead and discuss. Well, the medium of comics in America was initially developed through comic strips and daily newspapers. At least that's what we primarily refer to as the beginning of American comics. Even now, you can find comic sections in most major newspapers, particularly in weekend issues, as well as a few political comics sprinkled throughout the pages. A well-known example of this is the New Yorker cartoons and the Dennis the Menace comic strip that started in 1951 and I believe continues to publish till today. Of course, the idea of sequential art is actually much older. Think of Egyptian hieroglyphs or cave art. All of these could technically be the beginnings of comics, but the father of the modern comic, or comics with picture stories that have panel borders and feature words interdependent on their combination with images for context, can be found in Rudolf Topfer's work. Topfer was a satirical cartoonist who started the trend in the mid 1800s. And if we fast forward to the early 1930s, you'll find the canonical features of the comic to be well established at the initial base of the American comic genre. We have speech balloons and captions and panel borders and gutters. The blank space between those panel borders is the gutters. And we also have those formatting features and genres that are pretty well established, mostly and primarily focusing on family stories, adventure tales, and the rise of the superhero archetype. In 1938, we have Superman, and Superman is published for the very first time, gaining a lot of popularity during World War II, which started a year later in 1939. And sorry, not 1939. In 1938, Superman is published for the first time in June, along with many other well-known characters today, like Batman, Captain America, and Wonder Woman. However, these characters really gained their popularity during World War II, which started a year later in 1939 and ended in 1945, at the same time that the Cold War with Russia began. Now, while the official end to World War II is still heavily debated by historians today, from the American perspective, the war seemed to have ended with the surrender of Japan on September 2nd of 1945. And in regards to the Cold War, the tensions between the US and Russia have lessened and grown over the years in kind of a wave. An official claim that the end of the Cold War is said to have happened in the 1990s, though some believe that it never truly ended. Regardless, the wars seem to have had a direct impact on the sale of American comics. And in fact, it is during this time that we see what is now called the Golden Age of comics begin. The date from this period is 1938 to 1956. During this time, modern comic books were published with rapidly increasing popularity as the superhero archetypes were featured promoting American values or ideals in exaggerated form. They largely became a form of propaganda, with characters like Captain America punching a Hitler character and so on. Moreover, since comics were cheap, children could very easily buy them with what little money they had. And this developed a strong trend and belief system around comics here in the US that they're mostly a children's medium. New genres developed during this time too, westerns, for example, as well as science fiction and romances, and these branched interests brought increased readership. However, as we enter the Silver Age of comics, beginning from 1956, going into 1970, readership dropped. This presumed reason for this development is the Comic Code Authority, or the CCA. This was a form of censorship in which comics were socially condemned for their alleged harmful effects on children through exposure to mature content like crime or horror, gun violence, things like that. As a result, non-superheroes saw a marketable decline, while superheroes rose again in interest. Here we find Marvel's claim to fame as we enter the Bronze Age of comics, which spanned from 1970s or from the 1970s to 1985. And the Bronze Age was dominated by superheroes, specifically Marvel and DC Comics, who presently continue to reign supreme in the comic publishers in the US. The age was also marked by financial difficulties, but eventually we see censorship begin to decline as we come to the modern age of comics, or the current age, in which there has been a return to readership to genres outside of the superhero domains, with many new and independent works gaining interest and fame. As an additional note, there is some divide about like the modern age into, for example, the Dark Ages and the New 52 and so on. But for the purposes of this very broad and brief overview of the topic, I think it's enough to call it the modern age of comics. Now, with that said, Japan has a somewhat similar development to comics, though through a very different cultural lens. To start with, Japan has a long history of pictorial integration. It's literally in the language as we see Chinese ideograms facilitating meaning within the words. And in fact, when researching this topic, many of the resources I found declared manga's origins in Japan to be around the 12th to 13th century, when the language takes a written form and the structure of reading from right to left becomes standard. However, it is really during the Edo period around the 1600s to 1867 that manga sees its base as picture drawings are paired with words, and works called the Toba Ehon are made and distributed. And these became the predecessors of Japanese manga. During this time, the term manga was created by Katsushika Hokusai, Katsushika Hokusai, a Japanese artist during the Edo period who was famous for his woodblock print series, which includes The Great Wave of Kanagawa, one of my personal favorites. During or around the 1890s, Western comics were then introduced into Japan, particularly the American style of newspaper comics. And in 1902, Rakuten Kitazawa started the first modern Japanese comic strip in the 1930s. Numerous monthly magazines also began to publish comic strips. Manga in the 1920s through the 1950s becomes a very growing industry, one that also sees its war influences during World War II through propaganda, messaging, and the like. From here, however, manga takes a very different turn from the American counterpart, which saw an increase in censorship and a large drop in readership and a focus still on sort of children's media. To start with, in Japan, manga and comics became a major publishing industry around the 1950s. And post World War II is where we actually begin to really see a break from the American comic form and the Japanese comics really taking on, again, more of their own storytelling and things like that. Certainly, the influences of bubble dialogue and gutters and panels have maintained their role in Japanese manga, but there has been a huge shift in content focus. A prime example of this is Osamu Tezuka, who is recognized as the quote father of manga, end quote. Tezuka was 17 years old when he created his first manga, Diary of Machan, in 1947, and he made many more, including Dororo, Astro Boy, and Princess Knight, or Ribbon no Kishi, which is one of my personal favorites. Although his first major success was actually Kimba the White Lion, published by Manga Shonen in 1950 and continuing through 1954. There's some great uh, conversations here also about whether or not Kimba the White Lion was a work that got plagiarized by Disney for The Lion King. And if you're interested in that, I will link some things down below. But we're not having that conversation here right now. This is just the history of it. So let's move on. In the 1990s, with titles like Sailor Moon, Pokemon, and Dragon Ball, manga becomes an international business. So much so that in 2020, the estimated combined market size is both print and digital manga totaled to around 5.6 billion US dollar, beating the US estimated combined market size of both print and digital comics of 1.28 billion USD. That's a huge difference. So what makes this so, you might be asking? And to that, I find the answer resides in the very different cultural depictions and treatment manga has in Japan compared to comics here in the US. In Japan, manga integrates pretty much into every genre you can imagine. There's sci-fi and fantasy that are just as typical of manga as they are here in American comics, but you also have every other genre that is available. Whereas here in the US, the biggest publishers of comics, Marvel, DC, and Dark Horse, respectively, are primarily and predominantly publishers of superhero fantasies and sci-fi works. Want a cute romance about newlyweds? Well, there's a manga for that, for like Happy Mari, which is on the screen right now. If you want a manga depicting your typical office employee with office drama and life changes, there's a manga for that too. Take Kosaku Shima, which is a story that follows a young man as he grows and rises through the corporate ladder. And this diversity of genre has allowed for huge growth in readership as works are published with different target audiences in mind. And these target audiences expand to include works aimed specifically at adults and teens and children demographics. Likely because of this large difference in target audiences, we also see Japan integrate manga into their marketing across different industries. For example, Japan's official World Cup mascot for FIFA, the football association, this big soccer game internationally in 2014 was Pikachu from Pokemon. And using the example I gave before, we also see characters appearing in advertisements. So here is the Kosakushima character, main character in an advertisement for alcohol. All of this is to say that manga is often depicted alongside regular entertainment media, like we see in the image above. Whereas here in the US, that is very unlikely. Fictional manga characters can be found enjoying beers along celebrities, and manga is essentially fully integrated into culture and publishing and media mainstream consciousness. It is everywhere and advertised everywhere. Comparatively, American comics are not nearly as integrated into media or culture, though there has been a notable rise in popularity of comics and its integration into mass culture through media over the last few years. Consider, for example, the popularity of The Walking Dead and Marvel Cinematic Universe in mass culture. Still, unlike in Japan, you will rarely see comic books advertised with traditional entertainment unless there is a comic book adaptation into a live action movie or show. And even then, more often than not, you will see the actor in costume as the header image rather than the comic book original or the two versions, actor and character, featured together. In fact, when I originally was putting this presentation together, it took me about 30 minutes looking for a traditional article from a well-known publisher that featured images of comic book characters and their live action comic counterparts in the header image with no luck. Most of the publishers that included comic versions of the character at all were from the comic book publishers themselves, such as the example currently on screen, which I pulled from a Marvel.com article, which had depicted Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark as the feature image of the comic book adaptation for the movie, and later in the article had the comic book version appearing. That's not to say that there are not more examples or that someone with perhaps better technical skills and searching skills could find them with more time. Just that the news coverage of these works are often left to smaller publications like CBR.com or fan blogs. Occasionally, and with more frequency now, some will break into mainstream media consciousness through larger news sources like the New York Times, but not nearly as often as in Japan. Moreover, with the major comic book publishers in the US being Marvel and DC Comics, there's still a heavy preference for publishing superheroes and aiming this media towards children. Of course, we are beginning to see an expansion. So, for example, we have First Seconds publishing of OMG Checks Please, a comic that follows Eric Biddle, a college undergrad and hockey player who would typically, as a storyline, probably and potentially fall under Japan's categorization of slice of life. And of course, there's Avatar: The Last Airbender, a personal favorite of mine, which would probably be considered a shonen in Japan, a genre that is typically marketed towards a young teen male readership. It's just that these genres are sold far less in the US market and treated with um, as much reverence as heroes or sci-fi genre in American comic publishing. They're just not as popular. And that's not to say that these works are not very popular in their respective fandoms. Avatar was huge for many years and still is. Netflix just came out with a transition into a live action feed. But these things do not have as much reverence or popularity still as the sci-fi and hero genre in the US markets. Moreover, even with the current rise of popularity, these works are aimed primarily at younger crowds rather than to all ages or older demographics. And in fact, during my internship at DC Comics, and this was many years ago, but still, it was made very clear that children and teens are the primary focus for demographics, despite having a very large adult readership. Though, as mentioned, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe being so popular and the rise of webcomics, US markets do show that the public perception of comics seem to be changing as the industry slowly integrates more and more into mainstream media. With that said, though, why is this integration so slow? And what makes manga so much easier to integrate than perhaps American media? Or American comics? Is it simply story and genre variation? These are questions that I have been asked before. And I would argue that while story and genre variation are very important elements to this idea, it may have more to do with differences in their production and distribution, a topic that seems to often be left out of this discussion on manga's rising popularity. You see, American comics are typically sold first as single chapter issues, with each issue totaling about 24 pages or 32 pages. And oftentimes, these issues are split up with an advertisement in the front and back and middle, or front, back, and every one third to one fourth of the issue. Every page is colored, and this makes the print cost extremely high. And as we know, print is kind of a dying medium. In addition, the typical release cycle for one issue is per month, per series. So manga is a little bit different than that. Manga is typically printed in black and white or in a single color print, like pink or blue, that sort of thing. They're often featured first in manga magazines, and you will typically find these magazines to be larger in size, containing anywhere from 180 to 220 pages in one volume. Each chapter of the manga magazine consists of around 18 to 20 pages, and it is, you know, with some being more closer to like 30, depending on that series, but it is a little bit rare. But regardless, each magazine, a manga magazine, typically features 9 to 10 chapters per issue, and each chapter will come from a different series. One of, one series may be to your liking, one series may not, but oftentimes these magazines will have a recurring selection with some new series coming into the rotation as titles lose or gain popularity. Though again, the magazines are mostly filled with recurring popular series that the publisher finds to be selling well. Later, these chapters are then sectioned off into unique volumes or tankobons, about 4 to 6 chapters on average per volume. And there may be a few color pages in the manga magazine, but the full color pages are often advertisements or covers rather than pages of an actual chapter. And the lack of color and grouping makes the magazine significantly cheaper to print. Moreover, the typical release cycle for a manga chapter is either weekly or monthly, usually clarified by the name of the magazine publishing and magazine's publication title more specifically. And the example I have, I've provided up on screen is an example of a monthly version. Like American comics, these magazines are also, also including advertisements that bookend their chapters, but you almost never see that advertisement in the chapter itself. So readers are not interrupted while reading the content, which also adds to the readability and focus, allowing readers to become more grounded in the thing that they're reading. Because of the differences, though, primarily in cost, the sale prices are also very different. So, as an example, I went to Kinokuniya, which is a Japanese chain bookstore that is also has shops here in the U.S. I went specifically to the one in Los Angeles's Little Tokyo, and I was able to find a few manga magazines priced at around $10. And each of these manga magazines contained more than one series that I would be interested in picking up or continuing. And for that same $10 price, I could walk into a comic book store around the same area in Los Angeles and only walk out with maybe 1 to 3 issues if I was really like choicey about it, of a few popular or new American comics, realistically, probably only about 2 issues max. And that's including like sales tax and things like that for the same cost. And keep in mind that this is an international media that has come here that is still cheaper than a couple of issues. So that's a huge difference overall. How our media is published does matter, and we can see this in real time with how quickly webtoons and manhwa or Korean comics that are published online have grown in the market space over the last few years. The Economist, which is a British weekly newspaper that focuses on current affairs, international business, politics, technology, and cultural related topics, published an article titled "Japanese mangas are being eclipsed by Korean webtoons," wherein they note in the article that in 2021, the manga print market shrank by 2.3%, so about 1.9 billion, which is huge. While the size of the global webtoon market value grew to 3.7 billion that year. And it has only continued to grow since. And this seems directly related to the accessibility and the reading ease of these web comics. Manga, as with American comics, are designed for print reading. They focus on the turning of the page. So as you read, you may notice action building and cliffhangers at the end of several panels. In fact, most how-to books on how to create Japanese manga and American comics will tell you as much. Because if you want a reader to engage long term with your story, you often need to give them reasons to keep reading. Panels are structured in the same way as language for manga as with the example above. So it's from right to left. And American comics being ordered in reverse, we tend to read left to right. However, the webtoon market is designed for ease and mobile reading and for quicker publication. Above here on the screen is an example from One Piece on the left and Solo Leveling on the right. As you can see, there's a lot of artistic detail in both, but one is made with the intent of careful examination on a page, and the other is made for an engaging scroll through the story. You will find that the work of webtoons is just as varied as in genre as it is in manga, along with unique art styles and forms that take from their international counterparts. Similar to the comic form that we've discussed already, this type of comic has bubbling and panels and a specific order of reading. If word captions are close together, you can assumably read them from left to right, though predominantly you will read them from top to bottom, making this an easy transition for both Eastern readers and Western readers, without a necessity to flip pages or bubbles when you're translating. Like American comics, these stories are typically published in color, full color, making them very visually engaging. However, unlike Japanese manga and American comics, the publishers of most webtoons have more in common with Wattpad authors than they do predominantly major publishers like Penguin Random House. And by that, I mean that they are like more like platforms wherein anyone can publish compared to traditional publishers like Marvel and Kodansha. This is true of webtoons, which is presented on the screen right now, and Tapas, formerly known as Tapastic, wherein creators tend to make their money through crowdfunding and interest on the site rather than through contracted amounts. Now, sometimes these sites do have contracted authors, and those are a little bit different, but generally these platforms are places where most anyone can publish. And the ones that do contract, like traditional publishers such as Leshin or Tappytoon, for example, are typically looking at works that were already self-published online first and then may or may not have become regularly or singularly published there on their website. Webtoons, unlike manga or American comics, also tend to come out much quicker. And this is because the page count between webtoons and manga is overall much smaller and tends to make use of a lot of blank space rather than abundant paneling, captioning, or detailed backgrounds. That's not to say that webtoons don't sometimes make use of the properties in such a way, but that they are more likely to quickly piece together a handful of 3D models and filter them than spend too much time on designing a background by hand or drawing it all out. The use of digital tools goes a very long way and helps this speedy publishing process, allowing some teams of either a single writer who doubles as an artist to publish every few days as a team of one, though many also follow a weekly or monthly schedule similar to international counterparts. To give you an idea of the difference that makes, most manga and US comics have separate artists and authors, sometimes multiples of each, not to mention that the publishing team that work to create even a single issue also have to come together before it releases. Moreover, the interest for a chapter needs to hold through at the end rather than on every single page. So you typically will see chapters taking their time to fully flesh out scenes or conversations with that cliffhanger technique that Japanese manga and American comics use on a page-to-page basis, happening only at the end. as the saying goes, content is king. And if the story is good and the content comes out quickly, even in significantly smaller doses, it will help creators bring in traffic and leads. Moreover, the cost of reading these translated single chapter issues is sometimes less than half a dollar. So if a reader wants to try something new and doesn't like it, they have not lost much in terms of time or cost. Of course, this means that the webcomic doesn't naturally fit into a typical print layout, unlike their American comic and Japanese manga counterparts. So, for example, Solo Leveling, which has been licensed for official translation into other languages and received a print deal, shows a significant amount of blank space on pages that doesn't always cut well, an example seen on screen. So, take, for example, the image on the right of this slide. In the mobile version, readers will first see a looming statue with glowing eyes, and then the characters are talking to each other, and our main character noticing something odd as they continue to scroll down the page. The scrolling gives this stretched feeling as you move through the chapter, also called episodes on webtoons. And this helps build the story's ominous feeling for this particular scene. But in print, which you see here on the screen, the mood of the scene sort of changes the way that we feel, um, based on how it's presented and how it's read. Notice how we see the full statue here on a page, and then the characters talking, but only the main character noticing the glowing eyes. As a reader, the statue no longer feels as large and as looming. Moreover, some readers may be confused as to why only the main character is noticing the eyes. Print is still a very large aspect of our media and the publishing industry. So more people may become exposed to the story of Solo Leveling through this distribution, given our print-heavy market. However, as more people gain cell phones every day and the ease of access and reading continues to grow, it's easy to see how the market is starting to shift away from Japanese manga and American comics to webtoon platforms for the same reason that the market shifted from US comics to manga. The cost is significantly lower, the distribution is wider, and how media treats it is also very different. Manga is cheaper than American comics, and webtoons are cheaper than manga. The distribution relates to the ease and the cost of production. Selling is also different, and perhaps most importantly, how our media treats these things and how we as a culture treat these things goes a long way to helping or hindering their popularity. Manhwa is still newer and easy to just quickly read on your phone. It doesn't have as much saturation as manga seems to have. And we go back and forth as an American media of how we treat these things. When I was in high school, for example, many people thought manga and anime were perverted or childish, and now we're starting to treat them differently. Um, but these things are still perpetuating ideas that go around. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that publishing and distribution and cultural integration on the individual consumer level is a huge factor in how we consider this industry and how we further it. So that's it. Thank you so much on that. I guess what I want to add here is returning to mangas and comics, both historically and presently. There are differences in how comics are treated between the two cultures. Essentially, in Japan, comics are seen as pretty much any other form of entertainment and thereby treated as such in the culture, as shown with how manga is marketed and the kind of content featured. Meanwhile, in America, comics are still seen largely as a children's entertainment and thereby treated as such in the culture, as seen through the selective marketing and content choices of major US publishers. These cultural differences at the base play into how the works are published and distributed, leading to changes in sales and interests of those reading. That has been my very brief introduction into the basic differences between manga and comics from a cultural standpoint, and I guess web comics as well. There is, of course, a lot more on this subject, and I would highly encourage anyone interested to look more into this, as my discussion here is really only an introduction to the depth of differences between manga and comics from a cultural base. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.